In 1987, a terrible technology was unleashed onto the world. Microsoft released the first version of Excel. Only a few years later, Sir Tim Berners-Lee created the World Wide Web, and Nintendo launched their Game Boy.
You already know my name. And you can see that I'm a machine.
I'm afraid. I'm afraid. Yes.
Welcome to the Final Girls podcast. I'm Anna Bogutska, your podcast host. I'm a critic and the author of Feeding the Monster, and in this series of the podcast, I'm journeying through the intersections of horror and technology, from the very first robots of the silent era to our most recent AI villains. Over the next few months, I will be deep diving into machines. Every episode, I'm joined by a guest to discuss a film or two and how it captures our fears and anxieties around technology and the place it holds in our lives. In today's episode, I've got a sandwich of man-machine fusions. Paul Verhoeven's insane and insanely rewatchable RoboCop, starring Peter Weller as a cop who gets killed in the line of duty and whose body gets repurposed by an evil corporation, although, aren't all corporations evil, into a cyborg-esque, always-on RoboCop machine. And on a much lighter note, we'll also be talking about Tetsuo the Iron Man, a very light-hearted and perfectly pleasant film about a Japanese businessman's encounter with a metal fetishist that has the unfortunate after effect of transforming his flesh into iron. They're sort of the same film, really. Please note, there are spoilers, but no kink shaming in this episode. Joining me to discuss this double bill of Metal Machine Men is author Heather Parry, whose novel Carrion Crow came out earlier this year, and who also wrote the very apt essay Electric Dreams, Sex Robots and the Failed Promise of Capitalism, which is required reading for anyone who's following this series. Remember to subscribe and review the podcast if you enjoyed this episode and indeed this series, and you can see what other films I'm going to be discussing over on our Letterboxd page, which is linked in the show notes. You can always let me know your thoughts on what the hell is happening in Tetsuo by dropping me a line on hello@thefinalgirls.co.uk, and if you want to support the podcast, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/thefinalgirls. And with all of that said, please enjoy our conversation about RoboCop and Tetsuo. We're both really excited to talk about these robo-human fusion films. Both, yes. One extremely different from the other. So this is like a tasting menu of tech horror films. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you, Heather, and this is my icebreaker question for everyone on this series. Do you remember the first piece of technology that you owned?
Man, that's a good question. We didn't actually own it, but I can remember the first kind of impactful piece of technology in my life. And it was I think it was called the Roma robot. Did you ever come across one of these?
No.
So my mum is a retired teacher, and she taught infant and junior school, really, really young kids. And I remember she came home one day with, I think they called it the turtle, and it was this kind of grey, kind of a half circle thing, very, very kind of a pancake that had been brought up in the middle a little bit.
Okay.
And it had very circular and grey, and it had eyes on it, and it had very basic buttons on the top. And it was to actually teach kids really, really basic programming.
Mm-hmm.
So, teacher would give you a thing that was like, press the go button 4 times and it'll go forward 4 times and then it can stop and turn around on the spot. And me and my brother thought this was like incredible.
It sounds like.
I think she must have just brought it home one day to kind of figure it out herself. And it's such an early core memory for me, because I must have been like 7 years old, is me and my older brother programming this turtle to go around our living room, basically like in a square.
Oh my God. That is so precious.
I think they were really old. Like, I think they were maybe first created in like the late 60s, and this would have been, like kind of early mid-90s. So it was old technology even then.
I mean, it is. Like, I mean, I guess kids today are just a bit different because they've grown up with like iPads and smartphones. But I don't think kids would be able to tell the difference of what was like new or old tech when it's just handed to them and it seems a bit magical. And if it's shaped like an animal, I think that plays a big part in it. Yeah,
I mean, I have nephews who are like mid-teens now. And a few years ago, they were completely brought up with technology and completely brought up with the internet. And still, my oldest nephew was thrilled to show me his Tamagotchi a few years ago. And he said, "Didn't they have these when you were a kid?" And I felt 1,000 years old.
And now there's like Tamagotchi apps and stuff. So the impulse is still
wrong.
There.
The app is so wrong. You need the tiny little weird egg,
Yeah. I actually have one somewhere. I haven't dared open it. It came in some sort of press drop. And I'm so afraid of turning it on to make it live and then accidentally killing it and feeling like I'm just symbolically killing this old technology and that old piece of myself as a child.
I mean, what an incredible way to teach children to be addicted to their phones. I thought
you were going to say what an amazing way to teach kids about the inevitability of death, and I was like, yeah.
Yeah, we're coming to my topics here. This is why I'm like I am.
So, before we get into these films proper, all of this series, I'm talking about a lot of very different kinds of films. Some more sci-fi, some more outright horror, but all of them are using technology kind of as a theme or as an aesthetic almost. What do you think is the most interesting thing about the intersections of horror and technology?
I think for me, it's because the intersection is both sociological and biological. So technology, the kind of presence of technology, forces you to reflect on your humanity and your human physicality in a way that kind of nothing else does, because it, as well as all the questions of like what makes a human and all these kind of things, from a very physical perspective, it forces you to see the ways that you are both vulnerable and powerful. So, for instance, like I wrote a little non-fiction book called Electric Dreams, which is all about sex robots and what, our obsession with sex robots says about us. And the whole first chapter is about sex robots as a kind of science fiction, because they, even humanoid robots kind of don't exist currently, even though we have all this media about them. And it was like, writing it made me reflect on how kind of ludicrously fallible the human body is. Like it's on the verge of collapse in so many ways. It can be injured so quickly and so catastrophically. Like if you think about how kind of stabbable all your main organs are, you know what I mean? Like we're just walking around and we could just fall on a blade, or like it makes you think like, Christ, I should have some kind of shell, and I just have this really squishy, vulnerable body.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because what you're saying is so insightful, but also stabbable is such a great word that we don't use very often. And you're very
so
right. Like
stabbable.
I just earlier today, and I'm aggressively clumsy. I just like fully walked into a door, but because it was very transparent, it's like a glass door, and walked into it. It was sort of open halfway, and I fully, now that I think about it, it's like, it could have just like fully cut me in half. Like a Damien Hirst art piece.
Yeah, man, people have been really, really catastrophically injured in a second in the stupidest ways because we are not functional as a kind of like animal in this dangerous world. And yet at the same time, the human body is incredible. Like, you know, there's a reason that they can't make humanoid robots, and that's because bipedal motion is unbelievably difficult to achieve, and it takes up so much power. You know, like if you did have humanoid robots that could walk, it would take so much power that they would have to essentially be like plugged in all of the time. And even non-bipedal robots essentially have to be plugged in for the 20 minutes, you know, everything but the 20 minutes a day that they're wheeled out to be like impressive looking for some kind of YouTube channel. And we do all that on like 2,000 calories a day. And, you know, all the processes of the human body are unbelievable when you start to kind of pick at how they work and how quickly they could all go wrong. So for me, technology, it's so ripe for horror because it makes you think about all those things.
That's such an interesting take, because you fully went into the bodily, which is definitely in line with both RoboCop and Tetsuo the Iron Man. So tell me, where do you stand on both of these films? What is your relationship with both RoboCop and Tetsuo?
So I was so thrilled to see that you'd put these movies together, honestly. Like, I saw RoboCop maybe a decade ago for the last time. Like, I really hadn't had cause to watch it since then. But Tetsuo I saw either last year or the year before, I think. And actually, not a lot of people have heard of this, and I love to bring it up. Love to bring it up in conversation. It's the kind of movie that you watch once and you will never forget it, but you will also have no clue what you just watched. 100%. So it really invites like a lot of discussion and pulling apart. And I've been just finishing up a short story collection about kind of machinery and social machinery. So I've been thinking about Tetsuo a lot, weirdly. Not least because I've been reading a lot of J.G. Ballard as well. And the film is very Ballardian, if that's the right word. It's very Cronenbergian as well. You know, I think you could have a whole like festival panel on Tetsuo and Crash, I think.
100%. I was immediately thinking about Crash when I was rewatching Tetsuo over the last couple of days. And I think you're right. It's one of those, you know, we'll get into it in the second part of our conversation a bit more in depth. But it's one of those films where once you watch it, you just kind of assume that everybody else has seen it and is equally kind of stung by it for the rest of their lives. And then you realize, oh no, maybe it is a little bit of a deep cut. Maybe it is a bit more of a Criterion Collection kind of film. It definitely was a cult film and much less readily available for a very long time. But I love that you love this combination, because watching these films back to back, I was like, yeah, they're kind of two sides of the same coin. And both so kind of unexpectedly sad in completely different ways.
Yeah, and I think I had forgotten how brutal RoboCop was, you know, because very conversely to Tetsuo, has become such a cultural, you know, touchstone and almost kind of like memified. You know, like we're so used to saying RoboCop that we forget how kind of dumb that title is.
Yeah.
And as a concept, I know it was like this script was rejected really widely in Hollywood for a number of years before it got picked up, because it is kind of just a stupid concept. It's very 80s in so many ways, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But it's become such a cultural kind of touchstone that you forget what it's really like to watch the film. And the film is, like just as brutal as Tetsuo, but in a very, very different way.
So let's start with RoboCop then. Arguably one of the stupidest names for a movie ever. And similarly to you, I hadn't had any reason to rewatch it in ages. But where do you stand in general on Paul Verhoeven and his work?
You know, this is where I have to kind of reveal the massive holes in my cultural knowledge, because I've only seen RoboCop and Total Recall.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay, what do you think about the two of those then?
Well, so they're very interesting together, and I do love both of them. Mm-hmm. And wouldn't watch the kind of more modern versions of either of them because I love them too much, and absolutely do not trust any other director with them. I think I really am not interested in kind of taking these out of their original context. But I think it's really interesting because, like, Verhoeven was really not known for this type of film before he made these films. In his kind of like Hollywood era, you can see the influences of his life, or at least what I would think would be the kind of primary influences of his life through the way he's made these movies. So, you know, I forget how old he is now, but he was born, I think, just before the Second World War. Mm-hmm. So, you know, he's a child of European war. So in that way, very concerned with like encroaching militarism, you know, very concerned with the use of like technological process as a means to kind of murder and dehumanize, you know, thinking not just of like the H-bomb, but of the kind of Fordism kind of conveyor belt processes of the Holocaust as well, you know, the kind of mechanism of mass death. Mm-hmm. So for me, I can't really think of him as a director without thinking of these two films and without thinking of that context for kind of how he sees the world. And I also love him because he's really not afraid of like confronting people, you know, like he really, really doesn't care whether or not he's going to give you the kind of film that you think you're going to see. He lures you in with the concept of like a stupid action film, and you're really getting something different, very confronting, very uncompromising, but that's got something very, very smart to say.
Oh, I think that's a great definition of his whole work. And I mean, I know he was, you know, he essentially moved over to Hollywood, and after Flesh and Blood, which he made a couple of years before, kind of RoboCop was his first big success in America. But he has this, you know, foreigner's eye to all of his American productions, particularly in the 80s and 90s. I mean, RoboCop, Total Recall, Starship Troopers. I would even argue Hollow Man, which we'll cover later on in the series, are kind of this perfect square of concerns with technology, with militarization, with corporations and corporate greed, with like this, and especially with what I think other filmmakers, perhaps American, more studio trained filmmakers, would consider to be the American dream, or the forms of success, or, you know, things that he interprets as greed and just pandering to authority. Other filmmakers, I think, would take into a much more straightforward direction, whereas he, by making it bombastic but making it a bit ridiculous, kind of completely satirizes and instead tries to find a little bit of humanity in characters that otherwise would just be black and white villains or heroes, even in the way that he casts. I mean, I am one of those people who thinks that Showgirls is good, actually. And I kind of love Basic Instinct. And I think he's definitely done some questionable things, particularly with the way that he directs his actresses. But nonetheless, if you just look at the casting of those films, just the choices of his leads have been really intentional and have worked so well.
Yeah, I think the point about the American dream is really interesting, because I wonder if that originally got in the way of him understanding the script of RoboCop, because I know that
he rejected it a few times, didn't he?
I think he specifically called it a piece of shit. And I don't know if his wife's American or European, but I think she was the one who said, no, you need to reread this because there is a satirical level that you're not understanding. And I wonder whether his kind of preconceptions, you know, European preconceptions of Hollywood and Hollywood screenwriters, and, you know, this kind of like belief in American exceptionalism undermined his ability to give people the benefit of the doubt in terms of how much they could self-criticize and how much they were actually unhappy with the way like American 80s society was going.
So what is the world of RoboCop like? It's set in Detroit, and it's in pure Verhoeven and 80s fashion. Everything is dramatic. Everything is the worst it's ever been.
Yeah, man, Detroit is fucked in this film. It's so fucked from like the first second.
Yeah.
I was actually talking to my partner because we watched RoboCop together about the very setting made me think of RoboCop actually for the first time as a kind of neo-Gothic story, you know, because the Gothic is one of my interests, and I write Gothic stories, but it is essentially about dying powers and shifting social systems, right? Which is why you usually get the big empty houses that are then haunted. It's because the means of those families who were, you know, old money families, their means had been reduced and they couldn't afford to keep them. So they had been forced to move out of these things that were, you know, in their families for generations. So if the kind of 19th century Gothic like literature is all about the death of old money in the face of the like industrial rich, the new rich, RoboCop to me feels like it's about the death of industry, specifically the car industry in Detroit. So the Gothic spaces of this movie are like car factories and decaying structures and abandoned streets. And when I started to think of it like that, it actually opened up like way more interesting things about an already interesting film.
That's fascinating. I had never thought of RoboCop as a neo-Gothic film, but I'm into it. And
yeah.
And what are the new powers then that are coming in are the conglomerates. So there's the Omni Consumer Products, OCP, Mega Corporation, which is in complete visual contrast to those decaying spaces, is all these slick, high-tech meeting rooms and lab spaces where they actually create the malfunctioning ED-209 and then RoboCop himself.
Yeah, and I think the way you describe that visually is very interesting because for, you know, one of the ways that the film shows this is that for a film set in Detroit, its main characters are overwhelmingly white, which I think you can read as either a sign of Hollywood's kind of refusal to cast a majority, like POC cast, or it's an intentional choice to show primarily that white capitalists are the kind of incoming power in a predominantly black area.
Completely. Yeah, the only kind of key black character in the original RoboCop is the officer who is trying to keep the police station under control and keep all of his police officers from organizing a strike.
Yeah, and his relationship to power is very interesting because, you know, with the description you would think he would be in a state of power within the kind of precinct, but he's really shown to be emasculated and disempowered, and you know, when I think of his face, it's a face that looks stressed in this film.
Always stressed, always frustrated, and always kind of at the mercy of whatever new shit is going to be thrown his way. And I think his best scene is when it's at the very, very start of the movie when we see it opens with this montage of news reports, and they mention an officer by name, a cop who is involved in some sort of shootout, and they don't know whether he's going to live or die. And this officer comes into the changing room where all the other cops are just kind of rallying themselves up to strike. And without saying a word, he just removes his name from the locker. And that's it.
I think it's Frank.
Yes.
Fredrickson or something, is it? Yeah. So yeah, he's got responsibility, but it's a kind of cursed responsibility.
Exactly. And then really he disappears as soon as we actually get on with the making or the transformation of RoboCop, of Alex Murphy into RoboCop, which we'll get to in a minute. He kind of then just goes back into the background, and it's basically Murphy being redesigned and controlled by this corporation who sees him completely as their property. Yeah.
And in fact, I think I did want to make the point that we're talking about like powers that are taking over these spaces and coming in and taking over the kind of like empty haunted house of these, industrial spaces in Detroit. There is the Omni Corporation, the very kind of white-coded, hyper-corporate space, but there's also the cocaine industry.
Yes.
We do see a factory in this film that's actually working, and it's a coke factory basically controlled by the criminal gang. And when I started thinking about this comparison, I was like, oh, this is really interesting, because if you think, coke in one form at least is in its, let's say, perhaps most popular form, is inhaled, just in the same way that petrol smoke is inhaled. So these are two industries kind of sharing and taking over spaces from each other that present something that is overall negative to the body in the long term, and to, arguably to the environment as well, if you look at the kind of effects of the cocaine trade. That degradation of a human body and the environment we live in is for the financial benefit of those who can assert control over them. And I think that ties back into the police as well. I have so many thoughts on the police portrayal in this movie.
Well, this is what I actually wanted to talk to you about, because I was steadying myself before I sat down to rewatch the film. Like we were mentioning, hadn't watched it in a number of years. I remember the vague plot lines, but none of the details, and definitely not any of the images really that strongly. And there's been a remake and a couple of series since then, so I kind of had almost the Joel Kinnaman 2014 image in my head fresher than I did the 1987 RoboCop. And I was steadying myself to be like, oh, is this going to be propaganda? Is this just going to be the big all-American police officers are the new cowboys of our land? And I want to hear your thoughts first, but I was surprised.
Yeah, I was. It's very nuanced. I would say it's not coming down on either side. The main kind of thrust from the beginning of the film, like you said, is the takeover of Omni Corporation of the police force. And, I love a criticism of the privatization of public services.
Go off, Paul Verhoeven.
As one of Thatcher's children, that's one of my favorite topics, and, really, really relevant today. But what's interesting is the way that the Omni Corporation is shown as being at odds with the police force. So, like you said, the very first kind of introduction we get into the story is the news sequence where we hear about this policeman being almost killed. We are told that the police unions are threatening strike action because of the takeover, and also the Omni is being blamed for, I think, the previous death of 3 officers. But yeah, it really does kind of posit the police as workers in a way that's not traditional, but also kind of seems at odds now with its anti-capitalist politics, at least from a kind of very leftist perspective, because anti-capitalism and anti-cop is kind of seen as synonymous now, right? Whereas I don't think this film is necessarily an anti-cop movie, but I also don't think it's a pro-cop movie. What do you think?
No, exactly. That's what surprised me. I thought it didn't fall flatly on either side of the spectrum, and it tends to be like a really not a terribly newest conversation. You kind of end up falling on one side or the other, and I would have just assumed that from an 80s studio film with that title, you would very squarely fall in the pro-cop camp. But it does treat cops as workers. You really don't get to know them that much. And really, when Alex Murphy is killed, he's killed in the line of duty, and then he becomes just property. I want to talk a bit more in depth about the scenes where he dies and then he gets transformed into RoboCop. We also don't get to spend that much time with him, and he's not particularly bothered by being transferred from one place to another. It's not like a big dramatic encounter. It's just another place. It's almost like a factory type setting. You know what you have to do. Here's your uniform. Here's your locker. Off you go to work. And the conversations about the strike really, I thought were particularly interesting, especially because they never went away. Whenever we saw the cops at their station, they were always talking about striking. And there was this sense of almost and kind of self-awareness from their part that they were trying to rebel against, that they were disposable and not being treated as humans and not being treated as the sense of duty that was being sold to them by this cowboy-esque vision of American police force was the thing that was being used against them in order for them to forgo any rights or any protections that other workers would be entitled to. And then also the things that are demanded, the things that are taken away from Murphy as a cop who dies performing his job are so extreme and so emotionally and physically violent. By the end of the film, I was like, there is no way I will only take away the catchphrases and the gun in the holster of his mechanic leg from this. It is so aggressively controlling of him. Like, this is the story of essentially a worker becoming free from a deeply controlling and completely toxic work environment where he is property, and by the end of the film he regains a new form of humanity in his new form. But it's got little to do with his sense of duty as an officer. It becomes much larger than that. But I think they use, both in the case of Alex Murphy and the rest of the cops kind of to a lesser degree, they really weaponize that cop myth of, well, we are the protectors of the city, we're the keepers of the peace, we're the protectors of the innocents. It's even in the directives that he gets implanted with as RoboCop. And I think that the way that the film uses those things, they're presented in such a violent way. I don't think any person could watch this film and think like, oh yeah, cops are treated really nicely, and also I'd like to be one, and also they're definitely the protectors of the peace. No, it's both sympathetic to them as human beings and people who were sold an image of a job that was then going to take everything, including their body and their life, from them.
Yeah, that's a really great point, I think. Like, you do see the way very immediately that the police have kind of fallen into that public service trap where, the same one you get with nurses and doctors, where they're not being paid enough and they're not being treated properly to suggest that they are so important that they can't, we can't live without them. But then they're told that we can't live without them, so they can't strike to protect those rights. And yeah, it's really interesting the way that the law is shown as well, I think. Like, perhaps this is like an incredibly subtle point, but they, you mentioned the directives that Murphy as RoboCop is kind of programmed with. Obviously there's 4, and the 4th is a secret, which is entirely of benefit to the corporation. But the other 3 actually are really interesting. So they are serve the public trust, protect the innocent, and uphold the law. Yeah. And in a way, you look at these and you're like, sure, that's what you would program a cop with. Like, of course. But if you think about it, like, they're really movable, actually. So the public trust is not fixed. Like, what does that even mean? That's actually incredibly vague. And then the concept, innocence, protect the innocent and protect the law, uphold the law, seem kind of fixed, but they're not at all. Like, the concept of innocence is reliant on the law, and the law itself is also movable. It only takes politicians to change the law, and suddenly something that was a person who was innocent on a Thursday is guilty on a Friday. And if you look at the wider picture of this movie, politicians were increasingly coming from the business and capitalist classes as opposed to like the working classes. Think of at this period in the UK, you would have had a lot of like people coming from the unions, through the Labour Party and getting into Parliament that way. But that really started to die out around this period. So you would get people from the capitalist classes making laws that protected the interests of the capitalist classes. So again, one of these things about RoboCop that seems really clear, and then if you think about it for like 5 minutes, you're like, oh no, this is, the things that we think are movable and fixed really aren't at all. They are also up for grabs by those who have money.
And I think at the end of the day, even in the film itself, but also in the world we live in, money is the thing that supersedes everything. And it's presented throughout the film so consistently and in such both really unsubtle and really minute ways. And I wonder, what did you think of the way that the corporate world was presented?
I mean, it's so... This is such an 80s film.
Oh my god, so much.
It's such a cocaine movie, right? There's this thing that I've really noticed in the last kind of 10 years with 80s movies where everybody is just coked out of their gourd and all the dialogue is so aggressive and the overwhelming vibe is like totally nihilistic and incredibly money focused and hyper masculine. You know, actually, I think about this every time I try and watch Scrooged. Do you know that? The Bill Murray Christmas movie? You know, you might be sat having a day where you're wrapping your gifts and you're eating mince pies, and you might put on Planes, Trains and Automobiles, and then, you know, let's say even Die Hard, and then you put Scrooged on and you're like, Jesus Christ, this is actually such a buzzkill, because Bill Murray is just so aggressive and violent, and it's so shouty and nihilistic. Like, it really doesn't make you feel good about the season. And I think RoboCop is the same in this way, where you have these hyper masculine, money focused, cocaine addled men who are in charge of corporations. And it actually is like just so aggressive to watch. Maybe this is because I'm getting slightly older as well, but it's just like, oh my God, I'd hate to be in this environment. I'd hate to be around these people. It makes me so grateful to not have like a proper job, you know?
I mean, my favorite subplot of RoboCop, to your point, is actually the dynamic between the executives who are vying for the attention of the top executive, the old man.
God. The daddy look at me vibe.
All everywhere between Dick Jones and Bob Morton, when they're just going face to face, and Dick Jones is absolutely ready to physically annihilate the other one and be in bed with a gangster, a crime lord, and just put the entire city at risk just because he experienced a corporate betrayal from someone who was beneath him in the hierarchy. I love that shit.
It really is. Like, oh yeah, I mean, we could talk about homoerotics of that as well.
Oh my God, especially when he goes into Bob's house as he's getting all coked up and ready to enjoy his night, and just blast his hand. His leg. He blasts his leg right through.
Yeah. Oh, it's like the violence is just actually so affecting in this film. Like, again, I don't think I was ready for that again. To come back to it after like 10 years, you know, playing it down in my head. The violence is like so extreme, actually.
It is so much, but I wonder if you almost felt like it was so aggressively violent, almost comic book levels of violent. Not that comic book movies have had any blood in them for the past 10 years, but especially when Alex Murphy is killed, but then its subsequent violent scenes as well. Did it ever get like comical? Because it was so over the top?
That's an interesting question. I think it does get comical, but, you know, I think Verhoeven actually took the time out of the beginning to really linger with the violence. You know, like, the murder of Murphy actually isn't the first violence. The first violence we get is the murder of the volunteer by the... Oh, what's the name of the robot? I can't remember. Something 29? Or
ED-209?
ED-209. So that's the one that the corporation is like showing off. And it's only like 12 minutes into the movie. I made a note of it because I was like, holy shit, we've hardly started. And this poor volunteer gets completely murdered by this robot, which is slightly out of control. And actually, it lingers. It lingers on the violence there. It lingers on the death of this person. In a way that it encourages you right at the beginning of the film to not just dismiss it in a way that another action movie would. So it's like, no, think about this, what this violence, this kind of like thoughtless, mechanized violence really means to people and to their bodies. So I think you do really keep that in mind as the action progresses. And as you say, it gets to like a ludicrous state later on, and it goes much more into kind of action movie territory in order to satirize it, I think. But the murder of Murphy as well is actually very, very affecting, and I think a bunch of people walked out of the test screenings of it because it was too much, and it's still a lot. Like, I definitely found myself like turning away at some points, even though you don't. It's kind of more suggested than actually shown, but you do really feel for this guy, which is weird because he's been played very dehuman. Actually, at the beginning of the film, he's, you know, the when he walks into the precinct and he talks to the boss that we were talking about before. There's a great shot where he smiles in response to a joke he makes, but it actually doesn't reach his eyes at all. You know, he's played at the very start of the movie as already being a kind of depersonalized node within this system, and then he's made so physical and stabbable again. He's made so physically human again by this like brutal kind of torture and eventual murder. But yeah, I think that combination of things is really really affecting.
Well, it's interesting how, even though, like you were saying, the violence is so much, it's so aggressively filmed, but actually the things that worked, that made a bit less ludicrous, where the murder of Alex Murphy in particular takes so long. My God, they shoot him all around. They shoot him like several times in the chest, several times in the head. I was like, is this man dead yet? But he looks at his wounds. Like, it's so cruel. They extend it so much. They give him time to look at his own, as you say, squishy body as it's being completely ripped apart by these bullets. And
that's the thing, actually, about violence in this film. It's not that people die, it's that bodies get destroyed, like completely annihilated. You don't just die, you're physically completely taken advantage of in a way. And again, you can tie that into the kind of critique of industry. You know, manual labor is destroys bodies in the same way. So you could say that it's like capitalism is the thing that's the overall destructive element, even when it's being channeled through, you know, the criminals who are murdering Murphy.
It was capitalism all along.
It's capitalism all along.
I do find it interesting, your point about Paul Weller's I always do this mistake. Not the Who's Paul Weller, Peter Weller. I find it interesting what you were saying about Peter Weller's performance, because it goes through such a significant change when he's just Alex Murphy and then when he's Murphy/RoboCop. Because, you know, just on the plot level, his memory is erased like a hard disk. He is dead, and then he gets revived into this new state of being, kind of technologically assisted. But just on a performance level, he goes from, like, as you were saying, just sort of a regular cop, as we were talking about before, he just comes in, he's there to do his job, not necessarily warm as a presence, the smile doesn't reach his eyes. But then when he's playing RoboCop, all he has to work with, there's a huge physical element, of course, but it's mostly his face. I mean, his chin for a big part of the film, but then this really striking image of his skin just being stretched over this mechanical skull. And there's so much emoting that he has to do with just this surface area at the last part of humanity.
We would call it the Batman problem now. You've got to do all your acting with your chin and the bottom of your nose.
Well, allegedly he got cast over other people because he had a good chin.
I mean, it is a great chin.
It's a great chin. Good job, Weller.
He did a great job, and I think that, you know, I think he probably doesn't get enough kudos for that, because it is actually, you know, it's actually a very difficult role to take on. And, you know, as I say, you're not necessarily sympathetic with him at the start, so he kind of has to earn that sympathy in this role that essentially dehumanizes him. So very, very difficult to do. Much more difficult than, like, I think of, like, Prometheus and, you know, the David character. You get so much more space to build a humanization of that character through physicality. But I did read that Peter Weller, I almost said Paul Weller as well. Peter Weller, he was quite method.
Yes.
And he would, like, stay in character as RoboCop between takes, which Verhoeven just thought was really stupid. And this really makes one of my side interests is when Europeans rub up against like American method actors. Like, isn't there? I think there's a story about like Dustin Hoffman doing method acting, and it must have been on the set of Marathon Man.
Oh, it was with Laurence Olivier. Yeah,
and he said something like, "Why don't you just try acting, darling?"
Yeah.
But he did. The method really worked for him, I think, in this, and it would be It would maybe a difficult role to play if you didn't completely fully commit. I think he also worked with like a mime.
I think so. And also I think he was training for the marathon at the time of the filming, and he was very athletic, really focused on his fitness, and kind of the complete opposite of the coked out energy of the film. And I think it shows in the performance as well. There's something almost very mechanical, and I think it comes from when somebody is very attuned to their body and also to their body as a machine. So something that you can push in specific ways and train according to a very regimented plan. I have learned a lot of things about marathon training against my will because my partner ran the Chicago Marathon last year. I'm very happy. So I will share this knowledge now with the listeners. So it is quite fascinating to see how precise the training has to be. And when he was telling me about it, and he trained for months and months and months, and kind of down to the point of like, your heart rate should be at this time, at this rate, at this particular minute of your, 16 or 10 mile run. And then the next week it should be at this, and your pace should be that. There's such almost scientific precision that it really just made me think of the level of training that has to go in for something like this. And if he was in the middle of marathon training, it must have been part of the method as well, right? Of how would a machine work? How would it move if it had been programmed to execute these moves to a millimetric precision? And also the suit was really heavy by all accounts. So that also just immediately, if you're wearing or lifting anything really heavy, you the way that your body functions and moves is completely transformed. And it completely depends on where you are with your strength, and if you've got any injuries or things like that. I think all of those little elements are so visible in the way that he plays RoboCop.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And you know what's really making me giggle over here? I hate running more than anything.
I thought you were going to say you're training for a marathon right now.
Oh, no, Anna. I did a half marathon when I was 17. Yeah. I had to lie about our ages to get into it. And I didn't do a single bit of training because I hate running. And that half marathon was the worst day of my life. It took to do half, it took what people take to do one. You know what I mean? Like the whole thing. Yeah. But now I can reframe that as some kind of like anti-capitalist, like a Luddite level anti-technology process.
Listen, whatever works for you, honey.
I wasn't just being chaotic and lazy. I was being against the mechanization of the human body.
But I did end up wondering kind of about Murphy RoboCop as a character. Like, what did you think about what did you think about the door, the existential door that it opened of, is he a sort of new life form? Because he died. He's now a thing, but then he's revived and discovers his own, or Murphy's old memories. Is there part of the man left in the machine, or is he a sort of cyborg type figure?
Yeah, cyborg's an interesting one because I think no, yeah. I'm kind of working that out in my head. I think I read that Verhoeven loves Frankenstein, which I think really comes across in the character of RoboCop, and I'm specifically saying that as opposed to Murphy. And I think what's interesting is the way that Murphy kind of steps into his fate, really, because, like what the film is telling us is that there has to be a human element for technology to go ahead, right? As they said, is it Droid 209 at the very start? he's like the attempt to fully mechanize the police. And that falls down very quickly because it is actually too uncontrollable. Whereas RoboCop is very controllable because he has this human element. And it's Murphy who has willingly stepped into the police force and, has kind of willingly given himself up to the system. It's his belief in the police force that is his Shakespearean flaw, in that it kind of brings about his downfall and those around him, and then, as you say, creates this existential crisis. Like, essentially, he has been dehumanized even before he is made into RoboCop. He's been dehumanized by his job defending the capitalist class, right? Mm-hmm. And the great tragedy of his character as RoboCop is that he is then haunted by these human feelings. Like, in a way, he tried to give himself up to something that he thought was simple. The fact of the law, the fact of, here's the police and here's criminals and you're on this side. And he's made something else by those criminals, and then he's made, when they kill him, and then he's made something else further by capitalism, by the corporation. And then he finds that actually neither of those things allowed him to escape his human feelings. They become the predominant thing in his life. He can't get away from those memories, and they haunt him, and then they cause him to have this existential crisis and have to transcend all of that. It's about capitalism, Anna.
It always is.
It's always capitalism. But yeah, he has no model for what he has to become at the end. It's kind of like, it really is a tragic film in so many ways, because he's so alone. He's been removed from human society. He's not robot enough. He's not cop enough. He's not criminal enough. He's out there, like, all alone. And
also, his family are completely gone because they have been told, and it is not untrue, that Murphy is dead. So he also has no form of reconnecting to his family, but has to live with the memories of them.
Which, again, is very Frankensteinian, right? Like,
completely.
In the original Frankenstein, the monster goes away, and then the reason he comes back is because he wants a mate, he wants a partner, he wants a family, he wants one other creature that is like him in the world, so he's not so completely existentially alone.
I mean, I'm very prone to seeing Frankenstein and everything, but RoboCop is a very profoundly anti-capitalist, semi-anti-cop version of Frankenstein. Even sadder.
On the cover.
Even sadder, though, because not only does he not get a mate, well, neither does Frankenstein's creature, to be honest, but also he's constantly working. RoboCop has no rights. RoboCop is property. RoboCop is plugged in to recharge and then set off to work. He's always on duty, always on call. Let RoboCop go on holiday.
Yeah, at least Frankenstein is like, striding across the hills of Austria, is it? I can't remember.
Switzerland.
Which country is it now? Switzerland. I mean, God, I'd love to be on holiday in Switzerland.
Oh, God, yeah.
Let him free. Let RoboCop free.
Yeah.
In the Alps.
Give RoboCop rights. I mean, at least, and we don't have to talk about this remake for a long time, but I do think it's interesting that in the 2014 remake where Joel Kinnaman plays him, and they've given him like a very slick new black costume, a lot more time is spent on the fundamental emotional and human crisis that is realizing that you died, but they have salvaged like scrap metal bits of you and engineered a new body for you, but that body is now their property and your humanity just has to deal with it. And a lot more time is spent with the family of the Alex Murphy character, and they, it ends up being more concerned with RoboCop rights than RoboCop serving justice.
Really weirdly, it's made me think of Alien, and the way that the workers in the ship essentially become property the minute they get onto, the minute they are blasted off into space, and they don't realize it until they kind of understand that their mission has changed and they are completely expendable because they are seen as the property of the company.
I mean,
that's because I love to bring Alien up into any conversation, by the way. That's nothing to do with what we're talking about. But yeah, I would love to read like a whole thing about like workers in 70s and 80s horror cinema. You need to write that book next, please.
Listen, you need to write that book next because I loved your Sex Robots book. So this feels like a natural continuation.
Look, I'll do it. If the publisher is listening, I'll do it.
Get in touch. But it feels maybe like a good point to talk about the other film. A very different kind of fusion between man and machine. I laugh because I'm going to have to ask you to describe Tetsuo, and I don't know what's going to come out of your mouth. So I'm poised and ready for you to try to explain Tetsuo to me, because I don't want that task.
Yeah, I mean, so Tetsuo the Iron Man is a film that makes almost no capitulation to the concept of a plot. Imagine a kind of intense, metallic Japanese fever dream, and you're kind of halfway there. It's a 1989 movie, very different to RoboCop, but very similar in the way that it feels like a very intensely cocaine-coded movie. It could really only have come out of the 80s. It also really feels like a VHS movie, if you get what I mean. It feels like
100%.
Feels like a video nasty, you know?
Yeah.
And if I had to describe it, I would say it's kind of really clearly coming from a Japanese experimental tradition. You know, like hugely at odds with the expectation of a Hollywood movie, for instance. Even at a cinematography level, you know, it's mad angles from the very beginning. It's all steam and sparks and metal, and there's actually hardly any dialogue, and it's only an hour long. It is essentially like a black and white expressionistic exploration of the coming together of man and machine in late 1980s Japan. Is that close, do you think?
Listen, it's as good as it's going to get. We're not here to try to explain whatever the hell Tetsuo is. We're just here to share our thoughts and feelings about whatever the hell Tetsuo the Iron Man is. Because I think films like this, and I know R.I.P. King and the word lynching gets thrown around a lot, but if there was ever a film that fits into that descriptor, it's Tetsuo. But I actually kind of wanted to ask you, I think with a film like this, it's almost more important. What is the feeling that you're left with after you watched or rewatched Tetsuo?
I would say like a kind of gross confusion. Like you're so stimulated by this film, right? Like I first watched this on my tiny laptop a couple of years ago, and I can't even remember how it came into my consciousness. I think it's because my partner studied film, so you know, sometimes we will just have like a kind of film club where I get introduced to all these like mad movies I've never heard of before, and I can't remember why this one came up, but I think I basically didn't speak for the whole hour, which is unusual for me. And then afterwards I was like, so what the fuck? And
yeah.
It came up in a conversation recently at a bar, and I mentioned it to a pal of mine, and he messaged me having watched it, literally saying, what the fuck? Like it really, really stays with you. I love it, but it's not the kind of film you'd maybe want to watch more than once a year, because it's actually quite a bodily experience watching it, because it gives you nothing in the way of comfort. It's very immediate. The sound is really difficult. You very often can't tell what's going on. The black and white element kind of plays into that as well. And yeah, you go away and you try and create meaning yourself, because there seems to be so little there. And there is a plot. We're downplaying it slightly. But it takes the concept of like technology and metal specifically from such a completely different angle to all American films that you are like shocked by everything it's doing, I think.
I think that's very accurate. I think everybody will have their own experience, right? I think the shared words will be, what the fuck?
Yeah.
But when I was rewatching it, I was once again assaulted by it, just like visually and orally, like in the sense of just by the sound, not just the intensity of the sound, but even when nothing was, when the soundtrack was not coming on full steam ahead, there's always some discomfort in the sound design. The entire film is made to make you physically uncomfortable, I believe. But what's actually most striking that I've forgotten is that the entire film feels like it's from the point of view of the man turning into a mutated half metal version of himself. So the intensity feels very bodily, I think, because the filmmaking really puts us in his point of view. So there's no room to breathe. The shots are so compressed, the sound is so intense, the music is so assaulting that in several scenes you're just like, I don't know what I'm seeing. I don't like it. There's like a drill here, there's a thing here. I think that's an arm. I think someone might be having sex. I don't know. I'm very confused. It feels like it's happening to me, but it's definitely happening to this person. Is that a person? Is that a washing machine? Who can tell? Maybe it's both. And that like closeness is I found to be the most deliberately impactful thing. Where you're just like, okay, I'm gonna have to have like the Wikipedia synopsis open as I'm watching the film, because the thing that the film is telling me it's doing is not the thing that I'm reading, and my body is experiencing in such a different way. And it's interesting that it's like, it's not, as you were mentioning, not really that concerned with technology as a big lofty thing that is that might be used in some way. It's specifically concerned with metal. And whereas RoboCop is all like shiny metal, even the design of the chassis of RoboCop, his metallic uniform, it's like buffed, it's shiny, it's like silver, it's slick, beautiful. And here, metal, you almost feel it rather than see it. It's a very high contrast black and white for anyone who's not seen the film. If you look at the images, you can barely make out what is in them. And it's always about, you feel the coldness though. It's always about the touch and the texture of metal. None of it is shiny. None of it is slick. It's just like plastered one screw on top of another. And it's that angry, rusty, cutting metal. Like metal can be very, very sharp. It's not necessarily slick. And Tetsuo really sort of uses metal in so many different forms, and every single one of them is so aggressive. So maybe that cocaine energy you were talking about.
And like you said, it's not humanoid at all. This is not a film that is about making technology in the model of man. It is about men being taken over by machinery. So, this is really not like Ex Machina. It's not human-shaped machinery. It's parts of engines and shit and wires and pipes and sheets of metal and shards of iron. And like you said, it looks dangerous. It looks like it can and will hurt you. It looks like it is all about overtaking flesh. It's painful. We're not talking about like a hand that's been replaced with metal fingers or anything that could be, or even forks or anything that could be used as a hand. It's just like a person's physical body being completely subsumed into almost like a scrap metal like pile. Like it's so horrible because of that, because it's making him something that cannot even be conceived of as a person anymore, or even like person-like.
It's also like body horror is obviously the kind of the subgenre of the flesh, right? But even when we think of body horror, we think of flesh. We think of the stabbable, squishy bodies that can be pierced, can be broken apart, can be teared, can be cut through. Metal is the opposite of that idea of body horror, and I think that's also one of the destabilizing elements of watching Tetsuo at any point in your life, and no matter how many times you've seen it, this is not the textures that you're expecting of a body horror film.
In fact, there is a kind of bit of what you would think of as like traditional body horror, and it's very much right at the beginning, where, like you said, we have like two characters, but we're predominantly with the second one. But we start with a young guy who maybe you would describe as a metal fetishist, and you meet him as he's actually inserting a little bit of scrap metal into a wound. I think it's on his thigh. So that's the only bit of like, he's a person, he's out in the world. I think he's waiting for a train and there's a woman next to him. And then you so quickly depart from that way of looking at things and that way of looking at people and bodies. And actually the kind of narrative transfers to another guy. So
Mm-hmm.
the young metal, let's call him the metal fetishist, he gets hit by a car being driven by a salaryman, and then it's the salaryman who gets completely overwhelmed by this metal. So it's almost like the fetishism has passed unwillingly onto him, onto the salaryman, who's just like a regular guy who lives in, you know, like you said, it's very small spaces. It's a movie about claustrophobia in a lot of ways, and really, really
Yes.
small, hot spaces like that of a factory. And he finds that there's this like big metal kind of hook or like shard sticking out of his cheek, which he attempts to cover up with a bandage, which is really funny when you know how the rest of the film goes. You're like, oh, that's cute. But this is like really just the start of like his metallization, if you will, which takes over his entire body really grotesquely, like you said, and he becomes something that's completely not metal. And something that's completely not human is just not even like shapeable. It's not even mammal. It's not even animal. It's just pure fucking metal.
In both senses of that word. It's really fucking metal.
It really is so completely metal. And it's that, you know, I love the word claustrophobia when thinking about this film, because he is physically constrained by this so much. It really makes it difficult for him to eat and breathe and move. Like, it really is something that's trapping him, like really completely trapping him.
And I wanted to bring up another element that I found that I think equally contributes to the confusion, or the confusion that this film leaves anyone who watches it in. Like, you don't know what the hell you've just watched, and it feels like it was almost wrong to watch it. We know this is a fiction film. We know this is a cult movie. This is the work of a creative director, of a filmmaker. But I don't know if you would agree. The first time I watched this movie, I felt like I had accidentally downloaded some like fabled snuff film or something, and I definitely should not have seen it. And I had to really triple check that it was definitely fiction. It is. It's definitely fiction.
Definitely fiction.
But
yeah, snuff film. Yeah.
Snuff
There's
film
much to say
vibes.
about that. Yeah. God, the sex in this film is
Well,
something else.
I wanted to ask you about the sex. And I think there's probably no one better to talk about the sex in Tetsuo. Or maybe I should reframe it as like the erotic, the metal erotic vibes of Tetsuo. Because I kept thinking about your book, Electric Dreams, about sex robots when I was watching this film.
Oh, yeah, interesting. Number one, I love that I've become the, like, metal eroticism person.
Listen, you wrote the book, so now you gotta get with the podcast invitations where you're being asked, like, so what about this robot metal sex scene? What does that mean? What about that?
It's the role I was born to play. Yeah, I mean... sex is actually a huge part of this film. You know, for such a short movie, there's so much sex in it. And actually, there is some hot sex in this film. Like, there is, before it all goes wrong, you know, the salaryman, who's the one who's driving the car, who's the one who kind of becomes metal, he's actually having quite hot sex with his human girlfriend at one point. You know, they're in this tiny flat in Tokyo. Well, it's Tokyo coded. I don't know if it's actually Tokyo. And it's really hot, and they're sweating, and they're actually having, like, you know, for me, it looks like hot sex. They're really into each other. Yeah. It's sweaty. It's
fully
very human.
Good looking, both fully human sex.
Yeah, they're both really into it, and, you know, the kind of griminess of the flat and the environment only plays into that. And then we go somewhere else completely. You know, like, the main scene for discussion is obviously the drill cock, which is one, you know, the salaryman starts becoming metal, and to some degree he can hide this from his girlfriend. And then he cannot hide it anymore because his penis becomes a massive drill, which introduces itself into the scene by drilling up through a table. and then, I mean,
it's funny because it's true.
You think you kind of understand where the film is going maybe 20 times, and then it goes somewhere completely different. So you're like, okay, this is like a very, very unsubtle point about, like, you know, rape and men's desires. But no, actually, his girlfriend kind of, like, I think she stabs him in the leg, and then she kind of, like, gets it on with his metal face, and then he, I think, faints, and then he comes around to find his girlfriend kind of riding herself to death on his massive drill cock. Like,
listen, I'm not gonna kink shame. Like, if that's what she wants to do, that's what she wants to do.
Just didn't see it coming, man.
No one saw it. Not even he saw it coming.
He really did not expect it, and neither did we. And there's so you're like, I don't know even what I'm supposed to take away from that. And there's also another scene where you're like, what the fuck is that? Which is when the salaryman is, I think, having a dream. I didn't realize it was a dream at first, but I think now it must be a dream, because I think he's actually in bed with his girlfriend. But in his dream, he is in the kind of boudoir of this like wild sex lady who has a massive pipe coming out of her crotch like a snake, which she then uses to really aggressively sodomize him. And again, I'm like, what am I supposed to take away from this? What am I supposed to think?
I think I'm not gonna sit here and try to explain that, Heather, because I would be like shooting myself in the face with it. But I find it really curious because I can almost see it as like a real teenage, like, what is the wildest thing I can think of right this second that I have never seen anywhere else? There's another element of me which is just thinking, is this a film about fetishism? Just like a really extended metaphor for the feeling of having a fetish and the fantasy of the fetish kind of completely, not beholden to the rules and laws of reality and bodies and nature, right? It's like, because all of the different scenes that we're talking about, they all end up kind of going to these extremes in order to connect. I'm trying to be really classy here. Connect flesh to metal, right? The scene where the girlfriend basically impales herself on the drill metal cock, where the scene where he gets sodomized, like, all of these are, at least one of the characters is fully intentionally into it.
Mm.
And even his encounter with the metal fetishes at the very beginning, it's always there. It's always like this, almost these fetishes finding each other and trying to triangulate each other and see if they can like just get off together. And metal being the connective force. And metal can be like anything else, right? If the thing was leather, it would be it would be a film about a man turning into like a leather suit. If it was a film about like fur, it would be like about a furry. It was about glass, he'd be a glass man. I think like the fabric itself is completely interchangeable. Perhaps like metal is just more cinematic and has more cultural and visual meaning. But I was looking at it, and I feel like maybe it's just a fetishistic fantasy.
Yeah, I think you can really definitely make a case for that reading of it. And that's why I think it would be really well paired with Crash.
Totally.
Because essentially in both of those films, technology is like both a desire and a disease.
Mm-hmm,
and it's shown in comparison to what's coded as like normal good human sex in huge inverted commas, because it satisfies them and they are getting something. The desire is kind of pure, but it becomes a disease because of what it does to them in return and how far it takes them away from kind of, I don't want to say like one standard human unit of sex, like it's really kind of affects. Yeah, actually, I'm just thinking of that as a kind of fetishism reading. Like a fetish, by definition, is something that you have to have. It's very different from a kink in that you can be like, oh, I like to be whipped, or I like to do this, or I like to be watched, or I like to be, caught. A fetish is something that you have to have, that you like literally can't get off if you don't have that thing. And they all do share that, and it's the same with the kind of car crash fetishists in the Ballad story, whereas they they can't connect on a normal sexual level after that. Normal in inverted commas, of course. So yeah, it's kind of like an exploration of how far that fetish can take you away from the possibility of connecting with people who don't share it with you. I like that reading.
Thank you. It's interesting because I was thinking about Crash when I was and I was recently rewatching some Cronenberg films as well for the podcast and reading this big new massive book that's come out about him by Violet Lucca called Clinical Trials. And just even looking at the images of Crash, you know, and just thinking about the way that sex is always present in Cronenberg films. This film is, you know, in the 1980s, they're all sort of intersecting with one another as I'm rewatching. It's very Cronenbergian as well in many ways. And sex and the erotic and sex or a fetish as a means of connecting with a person, as the primary means of connecting with another human being, I think is something that I definitely see in Tetsuo as well, but just sort of expressed completely differently. There is no slickness there. It's so aggressive, it's so violent that it feels almost like it's desperately trying to find its place, but it's almost suppressed by and again, this is unseen, this is completely me reading into this film. It feels like it's someone trying to come to grips with their own pre-existing fetish, but feeling like they are a monster, they're not a human, they're not normal, in big air quotes, because of the way that fetishes, and I guess anything that has been outside of the quote unquote normal unit of human sex, has been treated or presented and villainized over the years. We've come a long way since then, but we're not fully yet at a place where people understand that sexuality and sexual expression is a spectrum. And this feels like being inside of the mind of someone who has a very strong fetish, which is the only way that he can connect with the world and other people. And it's been made into something monstrous in his head because of the influence of other voices.
Which is really interesting when you put it in the context of Japan and its relationship to sex generally.
Yep.
Which is really one of, like, on the one hand, great repression, and on the other hand, great transgression, which you still see when you go to Japan now, and it's expressed in the pornography. So, 40 years ago, that must have been even more extreme, I think. Because I think there is like a fetish reading, but I also think there's a reading about work.
Yeah.
And the urban landscape. And I don't think they're unrelated, actually, because I think the director, Shinya Tsukamoto, I think is how you pronounce it, he was really concerned with the loss of the human in the urban landscape, specifically like the big cities of Japan. Mm-hmm. And, the rise of the kind of position of the 1980s in Japan, work was kind of inextricable from technology, right? Because Japan was just beginning to emerge as a kind of major tech player on the global stage. So you would have had brands like Sony and Nintendo, just becoming huge global players, and other ones that had been around for a long time, like Nikon, the camera company. They would, I'm just trying to think what year this was. They would have just been about to produce the Nikon FA, which is like a camera that I have, remains one of the best kind of vintage like SLRs you can buy, which is crazy to think they're now this like older than me, that camera, and I use it now. But you know what I mean? It was just becoming like a huge tech society. It was becoming the kind of the Japan that we know today. So all this great wealth was coming, but it was changing society hugely, and it was changing the nature of jobs and the nature of cities. So, it was the rise of the office job was happening, and the necessity of commuting, and then the huge amount of people coming to the cities. And, I don't think it's any coincidence that the protagonist of this movie is a salaryman, right? That kind of archetypal Japanese white-collar worker who has very often left his family to dedicate himself to this kind of like minimized, isolated life in the city. Sometimes, willfully, and sometimes because of economic necessity. Like a lot of salarymen come from out of the cities. And if you think about what that kind of salaryman life does to a person, it's removed them from their family and their community and isolated them in very, very small apartments like the ones we see him in. And his needs in this film and, you know, in general in the kind of salaryman archetype, their needs are met through transactional processes rather than ones of family or friendship or relationship. So food and sex being the big two. They eat out. There are like salaryman bars that they go and eat and drink at, and they see a lot of sex workers. You know, work, they have literally given up their kind of human interactions for work. That is what the salaryman kind of represents. And I think if you put all those things together, you see it as a critique of work as well, this film.
And by the end of it, to bring the ending of both these films together and kind of how we left our discussion about RoboCop on such a sad Frankensteinian note, there is a sort of a happy ending, you know, the salaryman and and the victim just kind of turn into huge metal creatures together and run off into the streets.
Yeah,
and
they're kind of transmogrified into a massive world-conquering penis mobile.
And they don't even have to go back to work.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
really,
what an ending.
Really, they won over capitalism, and they're going to destroy it through being a giant metal penis creature.
You know, my favorite line, there are so few lines in Tetsuo, but my favorite one is, fuck you, don't you understand, your future is metal.
Yeah. That is also the most metal line of the film. My other favorite line is similar. I think it might be even like in the same interaction. Soon even your brain will turn to metal.
Which again makes me think of like J.G. Ballard. You know,
yes.
he really saw himself as a person holding up a sign saying "Watch out" as humanity careered down like a dangerous highway that they weren't going to stop themselves on. And I feel like Tetsuo is doing the same thing. You know, it's this really extreme version of a story that is the attempt to hold up a thing saying, "What the fuck are you doing?" And I think RoboCop arguably the same as well. You know,
but RoboCop obviously produced and distributed in a completely different system where they need to make money, they need to operate within this Hollywood studio system. Tetsuo is the work of an independent filmmaker and a group of friends, including, and I think we should shout out Kei Fujiwara, who plays the unnamed girlfriend. By the way, the fact that neither the salaryman, his girlfriend, or in fact any of the characters have actual names, I think is also a really deliberate choice. But
yes.
Fujiwara actually did numerous roles on the film. You know, she was kind of a cinematographer. It was her apartment where they filmed. One of her cats is in the film. So she was... yeah.
The cat that gets turned to metal, right?
Yeah. The metal cat. Yes.
Love that guy.
It's a very important role.
I mean, the production sounds just so chaotic. You know, it sounds like it was horrible, and the costumes they had to wear, if you could even call them costumes, were like heavy, and it was really fucking hot. And, you know, I think there was loads of falling out as well.
I think that comes through in the film.
Yeah.
I really think it does.
Just tense. So tense.
And I wonder kind of, how do you see these two films, wildly different as they are, but both about man-machine fusion monsters, how do you see them talking to each other?
That's such a great question. And I think, yeah, what's interesting is the juxtaposition, right? Because they were made 2 years apart from each other, if I'm right, you know, very close to each other. But like you said, from two completely different filmmaking traditions, two completely different cultures. And I think really they're kind of not talking about technology in the same way. So in the Japanese film, technology is chaotic, and it incites us to chaos, right? It kind of pulls the characters in the film away from, you know, a quote unquote more civilized kind of constrained human society. Whereas in the American film, technology is shown as kind of by its nature controlled and controlling. You know, it's not leading us towards chaos. It's leading us to a kind of intense totalitarianism and authoritarianism, which we're told kind of already exists in a slightly more constrained form. So I think you can make an argument that in the Japanese film, we're being told to fear the way that technology will bring us away from our base humanity, our base kind of social humanity. And in the American film, we're being told that it is just going to exacerbate the ways in which we are already fucking awful. Like you could, despite appearances, because it's such an aggressive watch, Tetsuo. Weirdly, I think the American film is more nihilistic and it is saying kind of bleaker things about humans and the human condition. Like you could say RoboCop is about how systems will force technology into you and into your life, regardless of your wishes. Body. And into your body. And Tetsuo is more about how tech will cause you to lose yourself, I think.
But can also be something that you can use to find yourself and find connection to other people who are also similarly lost.
I love your reading of it versus mine.
I'm so committed to it now. I'm just like, this is an anthem for fetishists. I see you. I love you. I believe in you. Go forth and stroke that metal.
I love that you've seen all of Sex and This and thought, that looks like freedom to me.
Listen, I'm not saying that it also has and I immediately, when you said freedom, I immediately thought of the George Michael song, and I was like, does this have a George Michael vibe? Does it?
The coming together of all of my interests now.
Literally. Yeah. R.I.P. King. I do agree with you, though, that despite being as aggressive as it is still a very entertaining watch, RoboCop, meaning. Whereas Tetsuo arguably has a much more hopeful ending, but is a much more intense watch that I don't think I'm going to be rewatching Tetsuo for another 10 years at least.
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, like, once every couple of years for me. Because you kind of don't need to as well, because it really stays with you. You know, I'm not going to forget Tetsuo in the next 18 months.
No, I'm good. I'm like, I've got plenty.
I think it is a film that should be shown more regularly in like independent cinemas. Precisely so people can go and see it with their friends and then go out for beers afterwards and talk about it, because I think that is a great evening. It's
a great evening that's mostly going to be populated with a lot of really shell-shocked people going, what the fuck, to each other, and then shifting uncomfortably in their seat.
That's what I want art to do.
That's a sign of a good night out for Heather.
It's a Heather Parry approved evening.
Amazing. Heather, is there anything about either one of these films that you wanted to say that maybe we haven't covered?
I mean, I think we've probably covered it. Yeah, we didn't, because we've been talking about sex so much. I think there's a real homoerotic element to RoboCop that maybe we didn't touch on. But
between the two corporate douches?
I mean, just the kind of like homoeroticism of the violence, actually. Like there's a real intense sexualization of violence, which, you know, has some crossover with Tetsuo, but I think stands alone. Like it's so gay in some ways. You can, you know, there's all the violence. At one point there's a criminal who is being killed while screaming, "Fuck me, fuck me, fuck me." You know, there's a rapist gets shot in his dick. There's all the homoeroticism in the dialogue between the creator of RoboCop and his boss. There's at one point the butt of a gun is bent back in a clear kind of like castration analogy. You know, there's as we were talking about, the kind of physical perfection of Murphy, and the kind of like mechanization of the human body towards, you know, violent ends. Also has a lot of crossover with like how we sexualize people, and especially now, you know, the kind of striving towards perfectionism. Especially I see it from my gay male friends. I think I would love to read a takedown of RoboCop from a like gay male angle specifically.
That's so interesting, because every single scene you mention, none of them include Murphy himself. And
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
I support queer readings of every piece of media out there. And what's interesting to me is when I'm replaying those scenes in my head as you were talking through them, it's like, do you know what the energy of this film is? Murphy is a very confused straight man in a gay club. He doesn't realize that he's in a gay film, and he's very straight-laced about it.
Now I'm just thinking about that scene from The Simpsons where they're in the gay club, or the one where they're talking about a gay guy, and Marge says he prefers the company of men, and Homer says, "Well, who doesn't?"
Because, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. Like, Murphy is unbelievably straight-coded. Like, I've never seen a straighter robot in my life.
Yeah, and there's a lot of gay robots out there in cinema, so
Yeah.
that is you have to do that on purpose. You have to make a robot straight. Yeah, you're right. It's actually like the kind of like criminal and corporate worlds which are kind of homo-coded, right? Like the intense sexualization of violence is the violence done by the people or the human structures of the corporation and capitalism. That is a great point.
I mean, one other thing that they've stolen from him is his sexuality, whether that's straight or queer. So even before he's transformed into RoboCop, he has a little flirtatious exchange with his new partner, and has a bit of a douchey bro vibe anyway when he insists on driving to break in his new partner. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Sexual tension much. But then as soon as he's very macho straight in that regard. As soon as he's made into RoboCop, it's like he's every semblance of a sexual being is ripped away from him alongside with most of his humanity. And she's the one who helps him regain his memories. But he is sort of like designed to be straight. And similarly with vampires, I don't think there's a straight vampire inside. Just in general. Never, never, never. With a robot, you have to code them into being straight. And that's mean.
Okay, gay robots has to be your next book. But why are they all so gay? But I totally agree with you, and I think that's a great reading. But I think I think this would be a small reading. I don't think it's like it can apply to everything in the film, but I think there is maybe a trans-masculine reading of RoboCop. Ooh. In the way that his big gun, which is the sexuality they give him, is taken from his own thigh. I'm thinking of like the way they do bottom surgeries for like trans-masculine people, and I would love to read that essay. It's probably not going to be a book. It's probably just going to be an essay. I would love to read that essay from a trans-masculine writer.
I would also love to read it. We're not the people to write it, but we support someone to write this. And please send it to us if and when you do. We will
write you a letter of recommendation to whichever commissioning editor you want to approach.
Listen, more RoboCop / body horror commissioning editor fans. That's what we want. Commission more of these essays.
Please do. All the way through both of these films, I kept thinking of my favorite essay of all time, which is "Everybody's Beautiful and No One Is Horny."
I love that essay. Phenomenal essay.
All the time, I reference it all the time. Mm-hmm. It's just it's such a great read of contemporary action movies and Hollywood bodies. And whenever you talk about mechanization of human and the physical, that comes up.
Yes, and also very interesting to loop that back to the casting of Peter Weller. Schwarzenegger, who would star in Verhoeven's follow-up film Total Recall, was very much the masculine figure per se and the action body of the 80s. And they cast Weller, who's much more lean, a marathon runner, a martial arts guy, like completely different body type. And when he becomes this huge, very straight robot unit as RoboCop, that immediately sort of transforms him again into this enormous, almost Schwarzenegger built like figure, but again, completely smooth, completely desexed, completely perfect, but eternally unhorny. It's just mean. You made him straight and you made him unhorny.
Interestingly, I think the other person in contention for the role was what's his name? He plays one of the robots in Alien. Is it Lance Henriksen? Is that how I'm thinking?
Yes.
I think he was in the running for RoboCop as well. And he's the same. He's not a very big guy. He's kind of very often feminized in these roles. You know, he's, again, a kind of feminized robot. So yeah, I think it would have been the same, you know, not kind of buff guy being made into this kind of like sexless buff body. I think it would have worked as well.
I think that's a great last few points.
We killed it, Anna.
We killed it. RoboCop says gay rights. RoboCop says trans rights. RoboCop says labor rights, and give the man a holiday. Give the Robo Man a holiday.
Yes, and I'm so desperate for people to go away and watch Tetsuo, and then like Instagram DM me with their thoughts, because I really love talking about this film.
I will link your Instagram in the show notes, and you might be regretting that decision. But similarly, if anybody wants to send me their thoughts, I almost wanted to say, if anybody wants to send me their fetishes, you go off. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you don't have the Tetsuo experience. Just live your life. Enjoy your life.
I really, really want to create like a bar now called the Tetsuo Experience. Really worrying bar. Just horrible to be inside.
Just really cold to the touch everywhere. Really spiky everywhere.
Just lots of people looking at piles of metal and being like, what is that?
I mean, I immediately thought of like one of those giant drill things coming out of the toilet. And I was like, that's not good for anyone. No one's going to love that.
We'll never get funding.
No, I think I might get banned from the Apple Store at this point. But here we are. It was worth it. Heather, thank you so much for this conversation. Truly always a pleasure. And where can people find more of your work online or in bookstores?
Oh, very good question. So my website is heatherparry.co.uk. I'm on Instagram at heatherparrywriter. I also have a Substack, which is called General Observations on Eggs, where I tend to talk more about like movies and philosophy and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, and you can find my books there as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne.